When Jake Martinez saw 95 Harley Davidsons roll into his crumbling garage at dawn, engines thundering like a war convoy, he thought his life was over. The night before, he'd done something no mechanic should ever do. He'd touched the daughter of a Hells Angels vice president without permission. Her custom wheelchair, built by the best engineers money could buy, was supposed to be untouchable. But Jake had seen something they'd all missed. Something that made him gamble everything. Now, as leather-clad bikers surrounded his shop, their faces hidden behind dark sunglasses, their club president stepping forward with clenched fists, Jake realized he'd either performed a miracle or signed his own death warrant. Before we dive into what happens next, if you appreciate stories about ordinary people who risk everything to do what's right, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring you more incredible true stories of courage and kindness. And if this story touches your heart, share it with someone who needs to believe in everyday heroes. Now, let's go back to where it all began. 14 hours earlier, Jake Martinez had made a decision that would change everything. But right now, standing in his garage at 6:47 in the morning, all he could think about was survival. The rumble started low, like distant thunder rolling across the Arizona desert, then grew into something that shook the windows of his small shop. One Harley, then 5, then 20, then so many he stopped counting. 95 motorcycles, to be exact. 95 members of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, all converging on his failing garage in Mesa like a leather-clad army answering a call to war. Jake's hands trembled as he gripped the wrench he'd been holding since he heard the first engine. Oil stained his fingers, ground into the creases of his palms from a night spent working until his body begged him to stop. He was 34 years old, and he'd faced danger before. IEDs in Afghanistan, firefights in Kandahar. But this was different. This wasn't enemy combatants. This was a brotherhood he'd challenged, a father he'd contradicted, a disabled girl he'd touched without explicit permission. The bikes circled his shop like wolves surrounding wounded prey. Chrome glinted in the early morning sun. Leather vests bore patches that told stories of loyalty, violence, and unbreakable bonds. And leading them all was a man known only as Reaper, 6'3" of controlled fury, his salt and pepper beard framing a face that revealed nothing behind dark aviator sunglasses. Jake watched through the cracked window of his garage door as Reaper dismounted his bike with the deliberate movements of someone who'd made this walk before. Someone who knew exactly what he was capable of. How did I get here? The question screamed through Jake's mind as his heart hammered against his ribs. How did a broke mechanic with a bum leg and a dying business end up standing between 95 Hells Angels and whatever judgment they'd come to deliver? The answer, he knew, lay in a single moment of truth 14 hours earlier. A moment when he'd seen something everyone else had missed. A moment when he'd chosen compassion over fear. A moment when he'd bet everything on his ability to see what others couldn't. To understand what happened, you have to understand Jake Martinez. And to understand Jake, you have to understand that his garage wasn't just a business. It was a sanctuary, a purpose, the last thing standing between him and complete failure. Martinez Auto Repair sat on the forgotten edge of Mesa, Arizona, where the desert crept close and the rent was cheap because nobody wanted to be there. The building itself looked like it was held together by hope and duct tape. Cracked concrete floors, peeling paint on walls that had once been white but had faded to the color of old bone. A rolling metal door that squeaked every time it opened, announcing customers Jake rarely had. But if you looked closer, if you really paid attention, you'd see something else. Jake's tools, worn as they were, sat in perfect order. Every wrench in its place. Every socket organized by size. The workspace might have been humble, but it was immaculate. That was the contradiction of Jake Martinez. He was broke, but he wasn't broken. Not where it counted. He'd learned precision in the Army. 8 years as a vehicle mechanic with the 101st Airborne, deployed twice to Afghanistan where he'd kept Humvees and transport trucks running through sandstorms and combat conditions. His platoon used to joke that Jake could hear an engine problem before it happened, could feel a misalignment in his bones. Mechanics keep soldiers alive, their sergeant had told them. Every bolt you tighten, every system you check, that's someone's kid coming home. Jake had taken that seriously. Maybe too seriously. His ex-wife used to say he cared more about machines than people. Said he could spend 6 hours diagnosing a transmission, but couldn't spend 6 minutes talking about their marriage. She wasn't entirely wrong. Jake understood machines. They made sense. They followed rules. When something was broken, there was always a reason. Always a solution. People were messy, eh? People lied. People left. Machines just needed someone who would listen. That Thursday morning, the day before 95 bikers would surround his shop, Jake was doing what he did most mornings. Barely surviving. Past due rent notices sat on his desk, their red stamps screaming final notice. His breakfast had been gas station coffee and whatever optimism he could scrape together. The limp from his left leg, courtesy of an IED that had ended his army career, made him move slower than he used to, but his hands were still steady. His mind was still sharp. He'd just finished replacing brake pads on Mrs. Chin's Honda, charging her half what any other shop would because she was 76 and living on Social Security. She'd tried to pay full price, but Jake had waved her off. What was he going to do? Take food money from a grandmother? His bank account disagreed with his ethics, but Jake had learned a long time ago that you can be poor and still be decent. In fact, sometimes being poor was the only time being decent really counted. Above his workbench, pinned to the wall, was a single photograph. 5 soldiers in desert camouflage, arms around each other, squinting against the Afghan sun. Jake was on the left, younger, both legs working, a smile that didn't carry the weight it did now. 3 of those men hadn't made it home. Jake had. And sometimes, late at night when the garage was quiet and the desert wind howled through gaps in the walls, he wondered if he'd survive just to end up here. Broke. Alone. Fading away in a garage nobody noticed. But then he'd look at his tools. At the photo. At the sign outside that read Martinez Auto Repair, we fix what others can't. And he'd remember that surviving meant something. That expertise earned through suffering had value. That sometimes the smallest mechanical flaw could mean the difference between life and death. He'd learned that in the desert. He was about to remember it in ways he couldn't imagine. The rumble announced them before Jake saw anything. Not the convoy. Not yet. Just one bike. But what a bike. The Harley that pulled up to Jake's garage was a custom build, the kind that cost more than most people's cars. Chrome so polished it looked liquid. Engine tuned to perfection. It rolled to a stop outside his open bay door, and for a moment, Jake just stared. Then the rider dismounted, and Jake's survival instincts started screaming. The man was massive. 6'3" at least, broad across the shoulders in a way that suggested he didn't just ride bikes. He could probably lift them. Salt and pepper beard, long hair pulled back, and a leather vest that displayed his allegiance in patches and symbols Jake recognized immediately. Hell's Angels. Vice President. The man's eyes were hidden behind aviator sunglasses, but Jake could feel the weight of his gaze anyway. There was something predatory in the way he moved. Not aggressive. Controlled. Like a man who didn't need to prove he was dangerous because everyone already knew. The man stopped 10 feet from Jake's garage entrance, looked around at the humble shop with an expression Jake couldn't read, then spoke in a voice like gravel rolling down a mountain. You Jake Martinez? Heard you're the best transmission guy in Mesa. It wasn't really a question. Behind the man, a custom van pulled into the parking lot. Black. Expensive. The kind of vehicle that suggested serious money. The side door opened, and a wheelchair lift began to descend with a mechanical whir that cut through the desert morning. And that's when Jake saw her. Sophie was 16 years old, though her eyes carried the kind of weariness that aged her beyond her years. Bright hazel eyes that missed nothing. Long brown hair pulled into a casual ponytail. She wore a faded band t-shirt and jeans, the kind of outfit that screamed normal teenager. But there was nothing normal about the wheelchair she sat in. The device looked like something designed by aerospace engineers. Sleek titanium frame, complex joint systems, LED panels displaying diagnostics. It was the kind of equipment that cost more than Jake made in a year, maybe 2 years. The chair descended the lift smoothly, and Sophie maneuvered it toward the garage with practiced efficiency, though Jake noticed the slight grimace that crossed her face with each movement. My daughter, the man said, and suddenly his dangerous edge made perfect sense. This wasn't just a biker. This was a father. She needs an oil change on her chair. Bearings been squeaking. Jake hesitated. His sign said he worked on cars and bikes. This was neither. I work on bikes and cars, not medical equipment. I wouldn't want to. The man stepped closer. Not threatening. Just closer. You work on anything mechanical. Says so on your sign. Martinez Auto Repair. We fix what others can't. Jake's own words, thrown back at him. He looked past the man to Sophie, who'd stopped her wheelchair just outside the garage bay. She was watching him with an expression that was half curiosity, half amusement. "He's not going to hurt you," she said, and there was the ghost of a smile on her face. Probably. Her father didn't react to her comment, but Jake saw the slight softening around his eyes. This terrifying man in the leather vest had a daughter who teased him, who wasn't afraid of him, who saw past the patches and the reputation to something else. "Name's Reaper," the man said, and Jake understood it was both introduction and warning. "This is Sophie. The chair cost $40,000. Built by specialists in California. Top of the line. But it's squeaking, and when I asked where to take it, 3 people mentioned your name. Said you see things other mechanics miss." Jake felt the weight of expectation settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just a job. This was a test. He could feel it in the way Reaper watched him. The way Sophie waited to see what he'd say. He nodded slowly, wiping his hands on a rag that was more grease than cloth. "Bring her in. Let me take a look." Sophie rolled forward, navigating the slight lip at the garage entrance with a jarring bump that made her wince. Just a small reaction, quickly hidden. But Jake saw it. He saw everything. Reaper followed his daughter inside, his presence filling the small space. Up close, Jake could see the details of his vest. The patches that told stories of chapters and rides in Brotherhood. The silver rings on his fingers. The tattoos creeping up his neck. This was a man who'd lived a life Jake could barely imagine. And right now, that man was trusting him with his daughter. Sophie positioned her chair near Jake's workbench, in the good light where he usually diagnosed problems. She looked around the garage with genuine interest, her eyes lingering on the organized tools, the old military photo, the humble but clean workspace. "Nice shop," she said, and she sounded like she meant it. Honest. Jake knelt beside her wheelchair, his bad leg protesting the movement, but his attention already focused on the equipment. And that's when his world shifted. Because what he saw in those first 30 seconds of observation would change everything. Jake's eyes moved over the wheelchair with the systematic precision he'd learned in the Army. Weight distribution first. Joint articulation second. Stress points third. It took him less than a minute to understand something that made his stomach tighten with recognition. This isn't a mobility device, he thought. This is a cage. The wheelchair was beautiful. State-of-the-art. Expensive beyond anything Jake had worked on before. And it was fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. Not broken. Wrong. There's a difference. Broken means something failed. Wrong means it was built to fail. The weight distribution was backward. The battery pack, the heaviest component, sat too far forward, putting 45 pounds of pressure on Sophie's lower back instead of distributing it through the frame. Her spine was being forced into an unnatural curve just to balance the chair's center of gravity. The wheel alignment was off by degrees, so small most people wouldn't notice. But those degrees added up. Every time Sophie moved, her body had to compensate for wheels that wanted to pull slightly left. After hours of use, that compensation would turn into chronic shoulder pain, permanent muscle strain. The joystick sensitivity was set so low that Sophie had to push hard to get the chair to respond. Jake could see the calluses on her right hand where she gripped the control. A 16-year-old girl shouldn't have calluses from asking her wheelchair to move. And the brake system. God, the brake system. It engaged unevenly, left side catching a fraction of a second before the right, creating a jarring stop that would snap her neck forward every single time. Jake had seen this before. Not in a wheelchair. In a Humvee outside Kandahar. The suspension had been installed wrong, microscopic misalignment that everyone else had signed off on. Jake had caught it during a routine check, insisted they fix it despite the sergeant saying it was fine. 3 days later, that Humvee hit an IED. The proper suspension absorbed enough of the blast that all 4 soldiers walked away with their lives. If Jake hadn't caught that flaw, hadn't insisted on fixing what everyone else said was good enough, those men would have died. He was looking at the same kind of flaw now. Different machine. Same principle. This wheelchair was torturing Sophie in slow motion every single day. "How long you been using this chair?" Jake asked, his voice quiet. Sophie tilted her head, surprised by the question. Most people asked about the accident. About what happened to her. About whether she'd ever walk again. Nobody asked about the chair. 2 years, she said. Since the accident. It hurt? Jake asked, and he was still examining the frame, his fingers tracing the support struts, feeling for stress fractures. Sophie went very still. When she spoke, her voice was smaller than before. Yeah, my shoulders, my back. But they said it's the best money can buy. Top engineers. Custom built. So I figured it's just me. My body adjusting. Jake looked up at her then, and something in his chest cracked. She'd been in pain for 2 years, and she thought it was her fault. Thought her body was failing to adjust to equipment that was supposed to help her. She'd been suffering, and she blamed herself because everyone told her the chair was perfect. Money doesn't always mean right, Jake said softly. Behind him, Reaper's voice cut through the garage like a blade. Something you want to say, mechanic? There was warning in those words. Danger. Jake could feel the temperature in the room drop. He was about to contradict $40,000 worth of expert engineering. About to tell a Hells Angels vice president that he'd been failed by the specialists he'd trusted with his daughter's life. Every survival instinct Jake had screamed at him to shut up, to fix the squeak, to take his money and send them on their way, to stay small and stay safe. But Sophie was looking at him now, and her eyes held something that cut through his fear. Hope. Desperate, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, someone finally saw what she'd been too afraid to say. That maybe she wasn't crazy. That maybe the pain wasn't her fault. Jake had learned in the desert that sometimes the smallest mechanical flaw could mean the difference between life and death. He'd learned that staying silent when you saw a problem didn't keep you safe. It just meant someone else would pay the price for your cowardice. He stood slowly, his leg complaining, and wiped his hands on his rag. The next words out of his mouth would either save Sophie or destroy him. He chose Sophie. Jake took a breath, held it, released it slowly. Then he looked directly at Reaper and said the words that would change everything. I can fix the squeak. But if you wanted, I could fix the real problem. The silence that followed was the kind you could cut with a knife. Reaper didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, 6'3" of controlled danger, waiting. Finally, his jaw tightened. What problem? Jake kept his voice calm, respectful, technical. The same tone he'd used briefing officers in the Army when he'd found critical flaws in equipment. The chair's built wrong. Weights backward, alignments off, stress points are torture on her body. Whoever designed it focused on looking advanced, not on comfort or function. She's been in pain because the engineering is fundamentally flawed. Reaper's entire body went rigid. Cost me 40 grand. Specialists from California. Multiple engineers. Doctors signed off on it. And you're telling me they're all wrong. I'm not saying they're bad at their jobs, Jake said, and he meant it. I'm saying they don't listen to machines the way a mechanic does. They designed what looks impressive. I'm looking at what works. And this doesn't work. Not for her. Sophie had gone completely still in her chair, her hands gripped tight on the armrests. Jake could see her barely breathing, waiting to see what would happen. Waiting to see if her father would accept this or explode. Reaper took off his sunglasses slowly. His eyes were gray, hard as steel, and they pinned Jake in place like a butterfly on a board. You got some balls, mechanic. I'll give you that. You're either the best I've ever met or you're running the stupidest con in history. I'm not conning anyone, Jake said. I'm telling you what I see. Your daughter's been suffering for 2 years because nobody wanted to admit the emperor had no clothes. Well, I'm not afraid to say it. The chair's wrong. I can fix it. Or you can take it somewhere else and she can hurt for another 2 years. Sophie leaned forward suddenly, her voice breaking the standoff. You really think you can make it better? Jake finally looked away from Reaper and focused on her. Just her. I know I can. The garage went silent again. Reaper studied Jake with the intensity of a man who'd spent his life reading people for lies, for weakness, for angles. Jake met his gaze and didn't flinch. He had nothing to hide. He was right, and somewhere in his bones, in his blood, in every instinct honed by 8 years of keeping soldiers alive in a war zone, he knew it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Reaper spoke. 24 hours. You rebuild that chair. You make it right. And if you're playing me, if you hurt my daughter, you'll answer to me. And 94 of my brothers. He turned toward the door, gestured to Sophie. Leave the chair. We'll pick you up. Sophie unbuckled herself from the wheelchair, and Jake moved quickly to help her transfer to a standard wheelchair Reaper pulled from the van. She was light, fragile in his arms for just a moment, and he could feel how much pain she'd been hiding. As Reaper wheeled her toward the van, Sophie looked back over her shoulder at Jake. Her eyes were wet, but she was smiling. Thank you, she whispered, quiet enough that maybe only Jake heard. "Thank you for seeing me." Then they were gone. The Harley rumbled to life. The van followed, and Jake stood alone in his garage, looking at a $40,000 wheelchair he'd just promised to rebuild in 24 hours, knowing that if he was wrong, 95 Hell's Angels would be coming for him at dawn. If you believe in standing up for what's right even when it's dangerous, hit that subscribe button. Because Jake just bet his life on doing the right thing. Let's see if it pays off. The garage door rolled shut with a metallic screech that echoed through the empty space. Jake stood alone now, the weight of his promise settling over him like a lead blanket. 24 hours. He had 24 hours to do what California specialists with advanced degrees and unlimited budgets had failed to do. The wheelchair sat on his workbench under the harsh fluorescent light, looking both impossibly complex and strangely simple at the same time. Jake rolled up his sleeves, pulled his toolbox close, and did what he always did when faced with a challenge that seemed too big. He broke it down into pieces. Assess, diagnose, rebuild. His military training kicked in like muscle memory. In Afghanistan, he'd worked on vehicles that had been pushed beyond their limits, machines that had to function perfectly or people died. This wasn't so different. This wheelchair had to function perfectly, or Sophie would continue suffering. And Jake would face consequences he didn't want to think about. He started with complete disassembly. Every bolt, every joint, every electronic connection. He laid the components out on his workbench in systematic order, the way a surgeon might arrange instruments before a complex operation. Frame sections here, wool assemblies there, control systems and wiring in their own designated space. The battery pack, heavy and off balance, went on the scale. 47 pounds, positioned exactly where it would cause maximum strain on Sophie's lower back. As Jake worked, his mind cataloged problems faster than his hands could move. The seat cushion wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. The foam compressed unevenly, creating pressure points that would cause sores after extended use. He'd seen similar issues with poorly designed body armor in the Army. Soldiers would come back from patrol with bruising and skin damage because the weight distribution was wrong. This was the same principle, just a different application. The battery placement wasn't just off-center, it was catastrophically positioned. 47 pounds sitting forward and left, creating a constant list that Sophie's body had to compensate for every single moment she was in the chair. No wonder her shoulders hurt. She was essentially doing a permanent isometric exercise just to sit straight. The footrests made Jake actually angry. They were mounted 2 inches too far forward, which meant Sophie's knees were forced into hyperextension for hours at a time. Chronic knee pain, potential long-term joint damage. And nobody had noticed because nobody had asked her to demonstrate how she actually sat in the chair for extended periods. They'd measured her once, in a clinical setting, probably while she was fresh and alert. They hadn't measured her after 6 hours of use when fatigue set in and her body started compensating in ways that would cause permanent damage. 6 o'clock came and went. The sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that Jake barely noticed. 18 hours left. He worked methodically, fighting the urge to rush. Rushing caused mistakes. Mistakes could hurt Sophie. He couldn't afford mistakes. Around 8 p.m., while examining the seat assembly, Jake's fingers brushed against something that didn't belong. Paper, tucked deep inside the cushion where nobody would see it unless they completely disassembled the chair. He pulled it out carefully, unfolding what turned out to be a small piece of notebook paper, the edges worn soft from age and compression. The handwriting was young, feminine, careful. "Someone please help. It hurts." For words. That was all. For words that Sophie had written and hidden where nobody would find them because she'd been told by experts that the chair was perfect. For words that said she'd been screaming silently for 2 years and nobody had heard her. Jake set the note down on his workbench, next to the photo of his old Army unit. Mechanics keep people alive. That's what their sergeant had told them. Every bolt you tighten, every system you check, that's someone's kid coming home. Jake looked at the disassembled wheelchair, at Sophie's hidden plea for help, at his own worn hands that knew how to fix things nobody else could see. This isn't about proving I'm right, he thought. This is about saving this girl from 2 more years of suffering. Maybe more. Maybe forever. He picked up his wrench and got back to work. 11 p.m. hit Jake like a physical weight. He'd been working for nearly 5 hours straight, his bad leg throbbing from standing too long, his back screaming from hunching over the workbench. The garage was littered with wheelchair components, scattered tools, discarded designs he'd sketched and rejected. And suddenly, sitting on the cold concrete floor surrounded by the evidence of his audacity, Jake felt the doubt creep in like poison through his veins. What if I'm wrong? The question arrived quietly at first, then grew louder with each passing second. What if I'm wrong? What if the California engineers were right, and I'm just some broke mechanic with delusions of competence? What if I make it worse? What if Sophie gets hurt because I was too arrogant to admit I was in over my head? He could see his ex-wife's face as clearly as if she were standing in front of him. Sarah. 3 years since the divorce, but her words still cut deep. They'd been fighting about something. He couldn't even remember what anymore, and she'd looked at him with exhausted frustration and said, "You always think you know better than everyone else, Jake. The doctors, the therapists, the marriage counselor, everyone. One day it's going to cost you everything." She'd been right, in a way. His stubbornness, his inability to admit he might be wrong, had contributed to the end of their marriage. He'd been so certain he could fix things, fix them, fix himself, if everyone would just listen to him. But he couldn't, and she'd left. And now here he was, making the same mistake again, thinking he knew better than the experts, thinking he could see what trained engineers couldn't, thinking his instincts were more valuable than their degrees. Jake's phone sat on the workbench, Reaper's number programmed in from when they'd exchanged contact information. He picked it up, finger hovering over the dial button. He could call right now. Apologize. Say he'd been hasty, that he needed more time, that maybe they should get a second opinion from other specialists. Reaper would be angry, but Jake would survive. He could live with looking like a fool. What he couldn't live with was hurting Sophie. The phone felt heavy in his hand, the weight of potential failure crushing his chest. Then his eyes landed on the note. "Someone please help. It hurts." For words that Sophie had been too afraid or too conditioned to say out loud. For words that represented 2 years of suffering she'd blamed on herself because everyone told her the equipment was perfect. Jake set the phone down. He looked at the wheelchair frame, really looked at it, and something shifted in his perspective. He stopped seeing it as a medical device built by experts he was challenging. He started seeing it as a prison someone had built without meaning to. A cage constructed from good intentions and expensive materials and absolute certainty that they knew what was best. But they hadn't asked Sophie what she needed. They'd told her, and she'd suffered in silence because she thought the problem was her, not them. Jake had been wrong before. God knew he'd been wrong plenty of times. His marriage, his business decisions, his belief that he could make a life work outside the military structure that had given him purpose. But this he knew. Not because he had degrees or credentials or expensive equipment. Because he'd spent 8 years keeping soldiers alive by seeing the things other people missed. Because he understood that machines were built by humans, and humans made mistakes. Because he'd learned in the most brutal classroom imaginable that sometimes the smallest flaw could mean the difference between life and death. "I've been wrong before," Jake said out loud to the empty garage, his voice rough with exhaustion and conviction. "But I'm not wrong about this." The clock on the wall showed midnight. 6.5 hours left. Jake stood up, his leg complaining, his back protesting, his hands steady as stone. He had work to do. Jake's fighting against more than just bad engineering. He's fighting against a system that values expensive over effective. If you're tired of people suffering because experts won't admit mistakes, comment, "Fix what's broken" below. Let's stand with the underdogs. 1 a.m. arrived with the kind of clarity that comes from pushing past exhaustion into a second wind. Jake had his plan now. Not just modifications. Complete reconstruction. He'd spent the last hour sketching designs, calculating weight distributions, measuring tolerances. Now it was time to build. The first modification was weight redistribution, and it was radical. The titanium plating that made up the lower frame looked impressive, but it was 12 pounds of unnecessary metal. Beautiful. Expensive. Completely wrong for what Sophie needed. Jake carefully cut away the excess, his angle grinder throwing sparks across the garage floor like small fireworks. In its place, he used carbon fiber panels he'd salvaged from a motorcycle fairing months ago. A crashed sport bike, totaled by insurance, but the carbon fiber was still good. Strong. Light. Perfect. He worked slowly, precisely, bonding the carbon fiber to the frame with epoxy that would cure stronger than the original welds. Lighter means less strain, he murmured to himself, documenting his process the way he used to document repairs in the Army. Less strain means less pain. Every ounce matters when you're carrying it for 16 hours a day. 12 pounds might not sound like much, but try carrying a 12-pound weight on your lower back all day, every day, for 2 years. That's what Sophie had been doing. Not anymore. The second modification was dynamic alignment, and this required precision Jake had only achieved a handful of times in his career. The wheelbase needed to be exactly 3 inches longer to properly distribute Sophie's weight. Too short, and the chair would be unstable. Too long, and it would be unwieldy. He measured 7 times before making a single cut. In the Army, they had a saying, measure twice, cut once. Jake measured 7 times because Sophie's spine depended on him getting this exactly right. He rebuilt the frame extensions using reinforced aluminum, adjusting the mounting points so the wheels would track perfectly parallel. The center of gravity shifted backward, exactly where it needed to be. Now Sophie's spine could sit naturally instead of being forced into a curve just to keep the chair balanced. He tested it empty, pushing the frame back and forth across the garage floor, feeling how it moved. Smooth. Stable. Right. The third modification came from an unexpected source. Jake had a mountain bike hanging in the corner of his garage, a relic from better financial times when he'd had money for hobbies. The bike had expensive microshock absorbers in the wheel hubs, designed to absorb trail impacts. He'd never thought about applying that technology to a wheelchair until now. He carefully removed the shock absorbers and adapted them to fit Sophie's wheelchair wheels. It took 3 hours of machining custom mounting brackets, testing compression ratios, adjusting spring tension. But when he finished, the wheels had a float effect that would absorb bumps instead of transferring every shock directly into Sophie's body. Every crack in the sidewalk, every threshold between rooms, every tiny imperfection in the ground that used to jar her spine. The chair would absorb it now, not her body. The fourth modification was the joystick, and this made Jake understand something about the original engineers. They designed the control system to be precise, which meant they'd made it require significant pressure to activate. Precise for them. Torture for Sophie. Jake recalibrated the sensitivity, increasing it by 40%. Now the joystick would respond to the lightest touch. Sophie wouldn't have to strain her arm anymore. Wouldn't develop calluses from gripping too hard. Wouldn't exhaust her shoulder muscles just asking the chair to move. The original engineers weren't bad people. Jake believed that. They just weren't listening. They built what they thought she needed based on theory and specifications. Jake was building what Sophie actually needed based on 2 years of her hidden suffering. That's the difference between engineering and mechanics. Engineers design. Mechanics solve. The fifth and final modification was comfort engineering, and Jake approached it the way a craftsman approaches fine detail work. He rebuilt the seat from scratch using memory foam layered with medical-grade gel packs he ordered from a supplier who owed him a favor. The foam would conform to Sophie's body, distributing pressure evenly. The gel would prevent heat buildup and provide cushioning that wouldn't compress unevenly over time. He repositioned the footrests based on measurements he'd taken from photos of Sophie in the chair. Her actual leg length, not the theoretical measurement from some clinical assessment. 2 inches back. It seemed like such a small change. Those 2 inches would save her knees from years of cumulative damage. The armrests got adjusted to her natural resting position. Not where some ergonomic chart said they should be, but where Sophie's arms would actually rest when she was tired, when she was relaxed, when she was just existing in the chair instead of sitting up straight for doctors and specialists. 5:30 a.m. The sun was starting to paint the eastern sky with the first hints of light. Jake stepped back from the workbench and looked at what he'd created. The wheelchair looked different. Sleeker. Less like medical equipment and more like a precision instrument built for a specific purpose. He tested every joint, every movement, every system. The wheels rolled smoothly. The shock absorbers compressed and released with perfect tension. The joystick responded to the barest touch. Everything flowed the way machinery should flow when it's built right. Built for the person who needs it, not for the people who designed it. Jake sat down against the wall, his body finally registering just how exhausted he was. 24 hours ago, he'd been a broke mechanic fixing brake pads on a Honda. Now he'd just rebuilt a $40,000 wheelchair in a way that would either prove him a genius or destroy him completely. The sun rose through the garage windows, the same light that had been there when this all started. 77 minutes until Reaper and his brothers arrived. Jake closed his eyes, just for a moment, and whispered to the empty garage, to Sophie, to whatever force in the universe listened to desperate mechanics. Please let this work. 6:30 a.m. Jake moved through the garage with ritualistic precision, cleaning up the evidence of his all-night rebuild. Tools went back in their designated places. Metal shavings swept up. Discarded parts organized in a corner. He worked slowly, methodically, the same way he'd cleaned his rifle in the army. There was something meditative about it. Something that helped calm the anxiety building in his chest like a pressure cooker ready to blow. He washed his hands in the small bathroom sink, scrubbing away the grease and metal dust and dried epoxy. The water ran black at first, then gray, then finally clear. He looked at himself in the cracked mirror, and the man staring back looked 10 years older than he had yesterday morning. Exhausted, terrified, but resolute. He changed into a clean shirt, the closest thing to presentable he could manage. Not that it would matter. Reaper and his brothers weren't coming to judge his wardrobe. They were coming to judge his work, to see if he'd saved Sophie or made everything worse, to decide if he was a miracle worker or a con artist who deserved whatever justice the Hells Angels considered appropriate. I'd gambled before, Jake thought, sitting on his stool with the rebuilt wheelchair beside him. In the army, I'd bet my life on my instincts more times than I could count. Trust your gut, the sergeant used to say. Your gut knows things your brain hasn't figured out yet. But this was different. This was betting on someone else's life. If he was wrong, Sophie would suffer. She'd spend however many more years in pain. But now she'd know it could have been better. She'd know someone had tried to help and failed. That might be worse than never having hope at all. And Reaper would make sure Jake never fixed anything again. The bikers wouldn't kill him, probably, but they'd make him understand what it meant to cross them. To gamble with a father's daughter and lose. The garage door was open to the street, letting in the cool morning air. Birds were starting to sing their dawn chorus. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog barked. Normal morning sounds in Mesa, Arizona. Everything peaceful and ordinary. Then, cutting through the peaceful morning like a knife through silk, Jake heard it. The rumble. Distant at first. Easy to mistake for thunder or distant traffic. But Jake knew better. He'd been waiting for this sound. Dreading it. The rumble grew louder, and Jake's heart rate kicked up despite his best efforts to stay calm. This was it. The moment everything would be decided. He stayed sitting on his stool, the rebuilt wheelchair beside him, and waited for 95 Hells Angels to decide his fate. The first bike appeared around the corner, chrome glinting in the early morning sun. Then another. Then 5 more. Then 10. Jake stopped counting when he hit 30 because it didn't matter anymore. They kept coming, an endless stream of Harley Davidsons, each one representing a brother in the club, each one representing someone who would stand by Reaper's decision, whatever that decision might be. They filled the street, the parking lot, the empty lots on either side of Jake's garage. 95 motorcycles arranged in formation that suggested military precision and absolute unity. The sound of 95 engines was physical. Jake could feel it in his chest, in his bones, vibration that made the windows rattle and set off car alarms 3 blocks away. Then, one by one, the engines cut off. And the silence that followed was somehow more intimidating than the noise had been. Leather vests everywhere Jake looked. Patches and insignias that told stories of brotherhood and loyalty and things Jake could only imagine. Beards and sunglasses and expressions that revealed nothing. They weren't hostile exactly, but they were absolutely, unquestionably intimidating. These were men who'd chosen a life outside conventional society's rules. Men who made their own justice. And right now, their focus was entirely on Jake. Reaper dismounted his bike slowly, taking his time, letting the moment build. His brothers parted as he walked through them, a sea of leather and chrome opening a path for their vice president. He stopped 10 feet from Jake's garage entrance, his expression unreadable behind those aviator sunglasses. The silence stretched out, taut as a wire ready to snap. Finally, Reaper spoke. "Where is it?" Jake gestured to the wheelchair on his workbench, and his voice came out steadier than he felt. "I kept my promise." Reaper walked forward, his brothers following like a tide. They crowded around the rebuilt wheelchair, some kneeling to examine it closer, others hanging back, but watching intently. Jake could hear murmurs. "It's different. Lighter. Looks cleaner. Frame's been modified. The bikers talked among themselves in low voices, technical assessments from men who knew machinery, who could see that something fundamental had changed. Reaper circled the wheelchair slowly, his hands behind his back, not touching but examining every detail. The carbon fiber panels, the adjusted wheelbase, the shock-absorbed wheels, the rebuilt seat. He spent 5 full minutes on his inspection, and Jake barely breathed the entire time. Finally, Reaper straightened up and looked directly at Jake. "Talk me through it." Jake's mouth was dry, but he started explaining. Each modification, each decision, why he'd made the changes he'd made. He used simple language, showing respect for their intelligence without talking down to them. These men might not have engineering degrees, but they understood machines. They understood function over form. They understood what worked and what didn't. Some of the bikers nodded along as Jake explained the weight redistribution. Others asked questions about the shock absorbers, technical questions that showed they were really listening. A few remained stone-faced, reserving judgment until they saw results. Reaper didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions, just stood there absorbing every word Jake said, those gray eyes behind the sunglasses evaluating not just the wheelchair, but Jake himself, looking for lies, for uncertainty, for any sign that Jake was selling them something he didn't believe in. When Jake finished his explanation, the silence returned. Reaper studied the wheelchair for another long moment. Then he looked at Jake, and the weight of that gaze was almost physical. Finally, Reaper removed his sunglasses slowly, and Jake saw that his eyes were wet. Not crying, just the sheen of emotion barely held in check. "Sophie's in the van," Reaper said, his voice rougher than before. "Let's see if you're a genius or a dead man. Right now, 95 Hell's Angels are deciding Jake's fate. If you're on Jake's side, if you believe skill matters more than credentials, smash that like button. Show him he's not alone." The van door opened with a hydraulic hiss, and Sophie appeared in the entrance. She was wearing the same band t-shirt from yesterday, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, but her face carried an expression Jake had seen before in the army. The look of someone who'd learned not to hope too much because hope hurt when it died. Cautious, guarded, desperately wanting to believe but terrified of disappointment. Reaper moved to help her, and for a moment the dangerous biker disappeared completely. This was just a father helping his daughter, his movements gentle and practiced from 2 years of routine. He lifted her carefully from the standard wheelchair they'd brought, and Jake noticed how light she was. How fragile. How much faith she was putting in a mechanic she barely knew. Sophie settled into the rebuilt wheelchair, and Jake held his breath. This was the moment. Either everything he'd promised would be true, or he'd just destroyed a 16-year-old girl's hope along with his own future. Sophie's eyes widened immediately. Her hands gripped the armrests, feeling their new position. Her feet settled onto the footrests that were now properly positioned. Her back straightened naturally instead of being forced into a curve. "It's lighter," she said, and her voice was filled with wonder. "It's so much lighter." She reached for the joystick, touched it with just her fingertips, barely any pressure at all. The wheelchair responded instantly, rolling forward smoothly. No lag, no strain, no having to push hard just to make the thing move. Sophie's face transformed. The guarded expression cracked, and underneath was pure, unbridled joy. She moved forward, testing the chair's response. Then turned. Then moved again. The bikers watched in absolute silence as Sophie navigated the parking lot, and with each movement, she grew more confident. The chair responded to her like it was an extension of her body instead of a prison she was trapped in. She rolled over a crack in the pavement, the kind that used to jar her spine, and the shock absorbers absorbed the impact so smoothly she barely felt it. Her posture naturally straightened because the weight distribution let her spine rest in its proper curve. Tears started forming in her eyes, but she was smiling. Actually smiling in a way that suggested she'd forgotten what it felt like to move without pain. She did a full circle around the parking lot. Then another. Faster now, more confident, her movements fluid and natural. The bikers remained silent, watching this miracle unfold, and Jake could see some of them wiping at their own eyes. Hard men who'd seen violence and lived rough lives, moved to tears by a teenage girl remembering what freedom felt like. Sophie stopped the wheelchair directly in front of Jake. She looked up at him, and tears were streaming down her face, but she was laughing. A breathless, disbelieving sound that was part joy and part release of 2 years of suffering finally acknowledged. "I forgot," she said, her voice breaking. "I forgot what it felt like to not hurt." Those words hit Jake harder than any punch ever could. For 2 years, Sophie had been in constant pain, and she'd forgotten that life could be different. She'd accepted suffering as her new normal because everyone told her the equipment was perfect and the problem must be her. But it wasn't her. It had never been her. Reaper had been watching his daughter with an expression that cycled through disbelief, joy, and something that might have been grief for all the pain she'd endured unnecessarily. His jaw was clenched tight, fighting to maintain control, fighting not to break down in front of his brothers. He removed his sunglasses completely now, not caring that his eyes were wet, not caring that everyone could see the emotion he usually kept locked down. He walked toward Jake slowly, and Jake tensed instinctively. This was still Reaper, still the vice president of the Hells Angels, still a man who could destroy Jake with a word to his brothers, still a father who'd just realized his daughter had been suffering when she didn't have to be. Reaper stopped inches from Jake. The garage, the parking lot, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. Then Reaper extended his hand. "You saw what million-dollar engineers missed," he said, and his voice was thick with emotion he wasn't trying to hide anymore. "You saw my daughter when they just saw a case study." Jake took his hand, and Reaper's grip was firm but not threatening. They shook, two men from completely different worlds connected by a 16-year-old girl who'd suffered in silence until someone finally listened. The silence that had blanketed the parking lot shattered. Bikers started clapping, whistling, shouting approval. Some of them moved forward to examine the wheelchair more closely, asking Sophie how it felt, marveling at the modifications Jake had made. Others clapped Jake on the shoulder, nodded their respect, accepted him in a way that transcended words. Sophie was still crying, still smiling, and she reached out to grab Jake's hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for seeing me." And Jake, exhausted and overwhelmed and barely able to process what had just happened, could only nod. Because he understood now what he'd really done. He hadn't just fixed a wheelchair. He'd given Sophie her life back. And in doing so, he'd found something he'd been missing since leaving the army. Purpose. Community. A reason to matter. The sun rose higher over the Arizona desert, warming the parking lot filled with 95 motorcycles and the family they represented. And Jake Martinez, broke mechanic with a failing garage and a bum leg, realized that sometimes miracles don't come from credentials or money or expertise. Sometimes they come from someone who cares enough to really listen. The celebration didn't last long. Reaper's hand was still on Jake's shoulder when his expression shifted from gratitude to something more serious, more purposeful. "We need to talk," he said, his voice dropping to a tone that suggested this wasn't a request. Inside, Jake's relief evaporated instantly, replaced by a familiar tension. He nodded, following Reaper back into the garage. Sophie rolled in behind them, and 3 other bikers followed, their presence filling the small space with leather and gravity. The garage door rolled down, cutting off the sunlight and the celebrating brothers outside. Whatever was about to happen, Reaper wanted it private. Reaper stood in the center of the garage, arms crossed, and the dangerous edge Jake had seen that first day was back. Not threatening, exactly, but absolutely serious. "You did something today that matters," Reaper began, his voice measured and controlled. "You fixed my daughter when nobody else could. When specialists with degrees and fancy equipment and all the money in the world failed, you succeeded. That means something." Jake waited, sensing the but coming before Reaper said it. "But you also disrespected 40 grand worth of work from experts. You called out engineers, doctors, specialists. You made them look like fools. You made me look like a fool for trusting them." Jake tensed, his mind racing through possible responses, possible defenses. But Reaper wasn't finished. "So here's the deal." Reaper pulled a folded piece of paper from his vest pocket and set it on Jake's workbench with deliberate precision. "You're going to fix every broken wheelchair, walker, and mobility device in our community. For free." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. For free. Every device. His struggling garage could barely keep him fed, and now he was being told to work for nothing. Jake opened his mouth to protest, but Reaper held up one hand, silencing him. "Your community?" Jake managed to ask, his voice tight. Reaper unfolded the paper, revealing a handwritten list of names. Dozens of them. There's 127 disabled veterans in Mesa and Chandler, Reaper said, and something in his voice softened slightly. Brothers who served their country, got hurt, and came home to a system that doesn't give a damn about them. The VA gives them garbage equipment. Cheapest bids. Lowest quality. The system fails them every single day. He tapped the list with one thick finger. These men and women sacrificed everything. Lost limbs. Lost mobility. Lost their futures. And their government thanks them with equipment that barely works and doctors who don't have time to listen. Reaper looked directly at Jake, and those gray eyes held something Jake recognized from his own mirror. Anger at injustice. Frustration at a system that failed the people it was supposed to protect. You fixed Sophie. Now you fix them. Jake stared at the list, his mind reeling. 127 people. 127 custom modifications. 127 lives he was being asked to change. I can't afford to work for free, Jake said, and he hated how weak it sounded. My garage is barely surviving. I have rent, utilities, I need to eat. We'll supply materials, Reaper interrupted. Tools, parts, whatever you need. You supply the skill. You supply the time. He stepped closer, and his voice dropped to something almost gentle. We take care of our own. And as of right now, you're one of ours. Before Jake could respond, one of the bikers who'd followed them inside stepped forward. He was older, maybe 50, with gray streaking through his beard and scars visible on his arms. I'm Marcus, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Lost both legs in Fallujah. Been in a chair 8 years. The wheels don't track straight. I compensate so much my shoulders are destroyed. Doctors say that's just how it is. Another biker moved forward, younger, maybe mid-30s, with a pronounced limp even standing still. Tommy. Blown hip. IED outside Mosul. They gave me a walker that's too short. Been killing my back for 6 years. Physical therapist says I need a custom fit, but insurance won't cover it. So I live with the pain. They kept coming forward. One by one. Names and stories. Injuries and inadequate equipment. Marines and Army and Air Force. Men and women who'd served and sacrificed and been abandoned by the very system they defended. Each story was a weight added to Jake's shoulders, but it was a weight he recognized. These were his people, his brothers and sisters in a way that transcended motorcycle clubs or social groups. They'd served. They'd sacrificed. They'd been failed. Jake looked at Sophie, who was watching him with an expression that said she knew exactly what he was feeling. She'd lived with inadequate equipment for 2 years. These veterans had lived with it for much longer. I don't know if I can help everyone, Jake said quietly, honestly. Some problems might be beyond what I can fix in a garage with salvage parts. Reaper nodded, respect in his eyes for Jake's honesty. Then you tell them the truth. But you try. That's all anyone can ask. You try, and you don't give up, and you don't charge them money they don't have. He extended his hand again, and this time it felt like more than a handshake. It felt like an oath. A binding agreement between men who understood what honor meant. Jake took his hand, and as they shook, he felt something settle in his chest. Purpose. The thing he'd been missing since leaving the army. The thing his failing garage and his divorce and his isolated life had stripped away. He was being given a mission. A reason to matter. When do we start? Jake asked. Marcus grinned through his scarred face. Brother, we start now. Day 1 began before the sun finished rising. Marcus's wheelchair was first, and Jake approached it the same way he'd approached Sophie's. Systematic assessment. Root cause analysis. Understanding not just what was broken, but why. The tracking problem was actually elegant in its simplicity. The wheels were slightly different diameters, a manufacturing flaw so small nobody had caught it. But over 8 years, over thousands of miles, that tiny difference had forced Marcus to constantly compensate, destroying his shoulders in the process. Jake rebuilt the wheel assemblies from scratch, matching them perfectly, adjusting the alignment until the chair tracked straight as an arrow. When Marcus tested it, rolling across the parking lot without having to correct his course, without his shoulders screaming in protest, he stopped in the middle of the lot and just sat there. His broad shoulders started shaking, and Jake realized he was crying. Marcus rolled back to Jake and pulled something from around his neck. His dog tags. The ones he'd worn through 3 deployments. You earned these, brother, Marcus said, pressing the worn metal into Jake's hand. More than I ever did. Day 2 brought Tommy and his too-short walker. Jake adjusted the height, added cushion grips that wouldn't cause blisters, and reinforced the frame so it could handle Tommy's weight without wobbling. The modification took 3 hours. When Tommy stood with the adjusted walker, his spine straightened for the first time in 6 years. The relief on his face was immediate, profound. His wife, who'd driven him to the garage, hugged Jake so hard he couldn't breathe. She couldn't stop thanking him, tears streaming down her face. And Jake stood there awkwardly accepting gratitude he didn't feel he deserved. He was just fixing what should have been fixed from the beginning. Day 3 changed everything. The bikers arrived with trucks full of equipment, new tools still in their packaging, materials Jake had only dreamed of affording. A professional pneumatic lift, welding equipment that didn't spark and sputter. They installed better lighting, transforming the dim garage into a proper workspace. And they stayed, learning, watching how Jake diagnosed problems, taking notes on his modifications. Reaper personally installed LED light strips while Sophie organized the new materials, creating a system that made sense. The garage was becoming something more than Jake's failing business. It was becoming a community hub. Day 4 brought unexpected attention. A local news van pulled up, cameras and a reporter Jake didn't recognize. Someone had tipped them off, probably one of the veterans Jake had helped. Jake was immediately uncomfortable, trying to wave them away, but Sophie intervened. She positioned herself between Jake and the camera and spoke with a confidence that belied her 16 years. "This man sees what nobody else sees," she told the reporter, her voice clear and strong. "The experts see specifications and regulations. Jake sees people. He sees suffering, and he can't look away. He doesn't fix machines. He fixes lives." The interview aired that night, and by morning, Jake's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Day 5 brought more veterans than Jake could handle in a single day. Not just bikers now. Word had spread through VA clinics and veteran support groups, and whispered conversations in physical therapy waiting rooms. There's a mechanic in Mesa who can help. There's a guy who actually listens. There's someone who gives a damn. Jake started working 16-hour days, barely stopping to eat, running on coffee and purpose. But he'd never looked more alive. The exhaustion was real, but so was the satisfaction. Every modification, every grateful face, every veteran who walked or rolled out of his garage with less pain than they'd arrived with. This was what mechanics keep soldiers alive actually meant. Day 6 was different. The bikers threw a cookout in the garage parking lot, and everyone Jake had helped showed up. Marcus and Tommy and Sophie and a dozen others, plus their families. The parking lot was full of motorcycles and wheelchairs and walkers and laughter. Brotherhood patches were on display everywhere, but the atmosphere wasn't intimidating. It was a family reunion. People who'd found each other through shared suffering and unexpected salvation. Jake stood to the side, watching the celebration, feeling simultaneously part of it and separate from it. Reaper approached with 2 beers, handed one to Jake, and stood beside him in comfortable silence for a moment. "You know what you are now?" Reaper finally asked. Jake shook his head, taking a long drink. "What?" "Essential," Reaper said, and there was no joke in his voice. No exaggeration. "You're our brother. And brothers protect each other. Always." Day 7 brought a moment Jake would remember for the rest of his life. He was under a wheelchair, adjusting the suspension system, when he heard Sophie's voice. "Jake!" Something in her tone made him roll out from under the chair immediately. And there she was, standing, not in her wheelchair, using a walker Jake had modified, yes, but standing upright, moving independently, walking, 3 steps, 4, 5. Her face was a mixture of concentration and joy and disbelief. Jake dropped his tools, unable to process what he was seeing. Sophie had been in a wheelchair for 2 years, complete mobility loss from a spinal injury. And now she was walking. "The chair helped," Sophie said, stopping in front of him, slightly breathless. "Getting my spine properly aligned, reducing the constant pain, it gave my body space to heal. The doctors said it was impossible, but they were wrong." She smiled through tears. "You gave me my life back, Jake. Now I'm going to help you save others." And she did. Sophie became Jake's assistant, his organizer, his advocate. She understood what the veterans were going through because she'd been through it. She spoke their language. She gave them hope just by existing, proof that improvement was possible, that someone cared enough to try. If you believe veterans deserve better than what the system gives them, if you think one person with skill and heart can change lives, Comment, brothers take care of brothers below. Let's honor everyone who steps up when the system fails. The sign went up on a Tuesday morning. Professional, printed, nothing fancy but legitimate. Martinez Mobility Solutions. Below that, in smaller letters, we fix what others won't. The garage was still humble, still the same cracked concrete and desert dust, but it was transformed. Organized. Purposeful. Alive. The bikers had integrated themselves into operations so smoothly, it felt like they'd always been there. Reaper handled scheduling, his natural leadership translating perfectly to logistics. Marcus coordinated outreach, connecting with VA hospitals and veteran organizations. Tommy managed material sourcing, his contacts from years of trying to fix his own equipment proving invaluable. The wall that had once held only Jake's old Army photo now displayed something else. 47 photographs. Every veteran Jake had helped in 3 months. Names written below each photo. Faces smiling in ways their families probably hadn't seen in years. The local TV station had done a follow-up feature story. The Mechanic Who Heals, they'd called it, and the title had stuck. Jake hated the attention, but Sophie reminded him that publicity meant more people getting help. More veterans learning they didn't have to suffer in silence. Jake had moved out of his studio apartment above the old garage location. The bikers had helped with a down payment on a small house, nothing fancy, but his. A real home with a yard and a garage where he could work on personal projects. He still drove his beat-up truck because new vehicles didn't matter to him. But he had purpose now. Family now. Sophie's note, the one he'd found hidden in her wheelchair cushion, was still pinned above his workbench. Someone please help. It hurts. A reminder of why he did this. Of what happened when experts stopped listening to the people they were supposed to help. Sophie herself had transformed even more dramatically. She walked with forearm crutches now, custom modified by Jake to fit her perfectly. She still used her wheelchair for long distances or when she was tired, but her mobility had improved beyond what any doctor had predicted was possible. She volunteered at the garage every weekend, and she'd been accepted to Arizona State University's biomedical engineering program for the following fall. I want to design equipment that actually helps people, she told Jake. I want to be the engineer who listens. Reaper had softened in ways Jake never would have predicted that first day. The dangerous edge was still there when needed, but around the garage, around Sophie, around Jake, he was different. Calmer. Happier. He brought coffee every morning, the good kind from the place across town that Jake liked. They'd become genuine friends, two men from completely different worlds who'd found common ground in caring about people the system had abandoned. One morning, while they were drinking coffee and watching Sophie organize the day's appointments, Reaper said something that stuck with Jake. For 2 years I blamed myself for not being able to fix her. I spent $40,000 trying to buy a solution, hired the best people, used the best technology, and it didn't work. He paused, staring into his coffee cup. You showed me I was asking the wrong questions. I was asking how much does it cost, and who has the best credentials. I should have been asking does it work and does it help my daughter. You taught me that. The Brotherhood had expanded Jake's mission beyond Mesa. Other Hell's Angels chapters had heard about what was happening, and they were replicating the model. Bikers across Arizona, then Nevada, then California were finding mechanics they trusted and connecting them with disabled veterans who needed help. Weekly fix-it days had become standard at Martinez Mobility Solutions. Veterans would come in for adjustments, tune-ups, modifications. The bikers had learned basic repairs from Jake, and they'd help with simpler jobs while Jake handled the complex rebuilds. It was a community in the truest sense. People taking care of each other because institutions had failed them. Then Jake got a call that surprised him. A VA hospital administrator from Phoenix wanted a meeting. Jake almost declined, his distrust of bureaucracy running deep, but Sophie convinced him to take it. The administrator was surprisingly direct. Your methods are saving the government millions in returned equipment and complaints, she told him. Veterans who work with you stop filing grievances. Stop returning chairs. Stop cycling through our system. We want to hire you as a consultant on equipment procurement. Jake's response was immediate. I don't want government money. I want you to listen to the people using the equipment. Actually listen, not just check boxes on forms. The administrator smiled. That's exactly why we need you. Jake took the consulting position, but on his terms. He'd review equipment specifications. He'd sit on procurement boards. But he wouldn't stop working in his garage. and he wouldn't start charging veterans for his help. The VA agreed. Some fights you win not by compromising, but by refusing to compromise on the things that matter most. Saturday morning arrived with the golden light that made Arizona beautiful. Jake was back in his garage, back at his workbench, working on a child's wheelchair. The boy was 8 years old, cerebral palsy, and his equipment was 4 years old and falling apart. His name was Daniel, and he sat patiently on a bench with his mother while Jake worked with the focused intensity that had become his trademark. Sophie was assisting, handing Jake tools before he asked for them. Their collaboration so practiced it looked choreographed. Reaper and 2 other bikers watched from the side, learning, taking notes, understanding that every modification Jake made could be replicated and taught and spread to help others. The work was quiet, almost sacred. This wasn't just mechanics. This was something more. Daniel's mother sat nervously on another bench, her hands twisting together, her eyes never leaving her son. Sophie noticed and moved to sit beside her, understanding the fear because she'd lived it. "I know you're scared," Sophie said gently. "But Jake sees things others don't. He saw me when everyone else just saw a medical case. He'll see your son." The mother's eyes filled with tears. Insurance denied his new chair. They said the old one was adequate. But it's not. It hurts him. He never complains, but I can see it. And there's nothing I can do because I can't afford a new one and the system won't help. Her voice broke. "I feel like I'm failing him every single day." Sophie took her hand, squeezed gently. "Not anymore." Jake finished the modifications an hour later. The chair's seat had been rebuilt with proper support. The wheels had been replaced with ones that actually rolled smoothly. The control system had been recalibrated for Daniel's specific motor control challenges. When Jake helped Daniel into the rebuilt chair, the boy's face lit up immediately. The chair responded to him perfectly, moving when he wanted, stopping when he wanted, giving him control he'd never had before. Daniel rolled to his mother, and his laugh was pure joy. The kind of sound that reminded everyone in the garage why they did this. His mother collapsed forward, hugging her son, crying so hard she couldn't speak. Jake stood awkwardly to the side, uncomfortable with gratitude he never felt he deserved. "Just doing what needs doing," he murmured. After Daniel and his mother left, after the garage grew quiet again, Jake sat on his familiar stool. Sophie settled beside him. Reaper leaned against the workbench, and the 3 of them watched the sunset paint the sky through the open garage door. The comfortable silence of people who'd been through something profound together. "Do you ever think about that first day?" Sophie finally asked. "When you decided to tell my dad the truth?" Jake smiled slightly. "Every day. Still can't believe I didn't get killed." Reaper chuckled, a sound that 3 months ago Jake never would have believed he'd hear. "You know why you didn't?" he asked, and waited until Jake looked at him. "Because you saw my daughter as a person, not a problem. You saw her pain, and you couldn't look away. That's not mechanical skill. That's character." Jake shook his head. "I was just trying to fix what was broken." Sophie reached over and touched her chest, right over her heart. "You did. But it wasn't the wheelchair that was most broken. It was in here. You fixed my hope." Jake looked around his garage, really looked at it. The wall of photos showing 47 lives changed. The tools organized on benches, ready for the next person who needed help. The brothers working together in the background, cleaning up from the day's work, preparing for tomorrow. This place that had been his failure was now his purpose. "I spent years thinking I was broken too," Jake thought, the words forming in his mind with the clarity of absolute truth. "Failed marriage. Failing business. Limping through life with nothing to show for my service except scars and memories. But I learned something from Sophie, from Reaper, from all of them. We're all broken in some way. Every single one of us carries damage we didn't ask for and can't completely heal. The question isn't whether we're damaged. It's whether we're willing to help each other heal. Turns out, the best repairs aren't about making something perfect. They're about making something work. Making something human again." The sunset deepened, casting long shadows across the parking lot where 95 motorcycles sat in neat rows. Brothers who'd come for judgment and stayed for purpose. A community built not on rules or regulations, but on the simple principle that people who've suffered should help others who suffer. That those with skills should use them. That sometimes the system fails, and when it does, ordinary people have to step up. Jake stood slowly, his bad leg protesting as always, but the pain didn't bother him anymore. It was just part of who he was. a reminder of what he'd survived and what he'd learned. Sophie stood beside him, steady on her modified crutches. Reaper placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. The three of them stood silhouetted in the garage doorway, looking out at a world that had tried to break all of them and failed. The screen faded to black, and white text appeared. Jake has now helped over 200 disabled veterans. The Hells Angels chapters across America have adopted his model, creating similar programs in 12 states. Sophie starts biomedical engineering school next fall, where she plans to design equipment that prioritizes user experience over manufacturer convenience. Marcus, Tommy, and 43 other veterans Jake helped now volunteer at mobility clinics nationwide, teaching Jake's methods to other mechanics. The VA has implemented new equipment evaluation protocols based on Jake's recommendations, requiring end-user testing before procurement approval. And Jake Martinez still drives his beat-up truck, still works in his humble garage, and still believes that the best way to fix what's broken is to actually listen to the people who hurt. Jake's story proves that expertise doesn't always come with degrees. It comes from caring enough to see what others miss. If this story moved you, 3 things. Subscribe if you believe in everyday heroes who choose courage over comfort. Comment, fix what's broken if you stand with people who help when systems fail. Share this with someone who needs to remember that one person with skill and heart can change everything. The world needs more people like Jake. More people who see suffering and refuse to look away. More people who bet everything on doing what's right. Which part of Jake's journey resonated most with you? Tell us in the comments. And remember, you don't need a patch or a degree to make a difference. You just need to care. We'll see you in the next story, where ordinary people do extraordinary things.